My name is Vivian Crawford. Welcome to Conversations Across Time. Seated next to me is my co-host, former Pennsylvania State Representative Babette Josephs. Welcome, Babby.
Thank you.
Conversations Across Time is the show that seeks to engage you in the fascinating study of history. What conversations could happen if historical figures from differing time periods were able to discuss their histories with each other? What would they have to say about today's issues? How did history makers think? What would they do if they lived today? Joining us for what we hope will be a lively and interesting conversation across time are, seated to my immediate right, Dr. Henry Kissinger. Seated next to Dr. Kissinger is Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega. Welcome, President Ortega. And seated next to President Ortega is one of our very frequent and favorite guests, and that is President Fidel Castro. Welcome, President Castro.
Thank you very much.
Now, this assembly is particularly interesting in light of what we see happening today concerning this country's desire to prop up dictators, prop up leaders in foreign countries, and we can see the ramifications of that. We can see the results of that. So because we have Dr. Kissinger here, I really do want us to engage in some conversation with you, Dr. Kissinger, about something that has always struck me as a bit strange.
Yeah, that's what that is.
And that is that when you were Secretary of State for President Nixon, there was a big to-do made about the welcoming of normalization of trade relations with China. China is a communist country. Now, by the same token, your president seemed very steadfast in wanting to keep the embargo against Cuba.
That's correct.
And the rationalization for that was that, well, Cuba is a communist country. So how did you rationalize having a relationship with communist China and refusing to have one with communist Cuba?
Because we regard communist China, as you call it, as a serious power. We do not regard Cuba as a sort of power. Mostly I find it to be a subsidiary or substitute, if you will, for the Soviet Union, a proxy of the Soviet Union.
And because they didn't have a huge population, an enormous economy, lots of military, we thought we could subdue them. Yes?
That is the idea we have had. That is their only value in the world scene is to...
I want to be clear. So you're saying the only value of Cuba?
Is as a proxy of the Soviet Union. That is all they are.
And the cigars and the sugar.
Yes, you're very facetious, madam.
I'm not meaning to make a joke, although it's deadly funny.
If we are, excuse me,
Certainly.
if we are only a proxy of the Soviet Union, why are you so unsuccessful in defeating our purposes for revolutionary living, for independent living, in spite of your embargoes, in spite of your ambitious motives to try and circumvent our people's liberty? If we are only a proxy.
You are a fine one, Mr. President, to talk about liberty as being a dictator yourself, repressing every sort of dissident that springs up.
Which has what to do with the Soviet Union?
It has everything to do with the Soviet Union. You have followed the Soviet model of nationalizing every sort of industry and therefore leading to the collapse of your economy after the Soviet Union collapsed.
That's ludicrous. We have not collapsed at all. We have gone on. We are prospering. We are fostering humanity in our country. Do you have humanity in your country?
We have plenty of humanity,
Too
Mr.
much.
President.
Too much.
No,
What do
we
you
don't
mean
have
too
much.
How can you say we don't have humanity? What do you mean?
take care of your sick? Do you educate your people?
No.
Of course we do.
No,
We
and
have
no.
some,
But that remains.
how is that possible? Since we have some of the finest universities in the world. We don't have.
It's a good question. How come we have the finest hospitals, the finest healthcare, great educational institutions, and probably there are more literate people, both in Cuba and in Nicaragua, than there are in the U.S.? How could that happen, Mr. Kissinger? You had nothing to do with
As
that,
Dr.
of course.
Kissinger, Madam.
I'm
and
so
as,
sorry, Doctor.
As an official of the state, as Secretary of State of the United States, I don't deal with such things as...
People's lives. I understand.
If you wish to say that, Madam.
Thank you.
I find it interesting that Dr. Kissinger, that as I said, you have not given me an answer, at least not to my satisfaction, as to why you had such disdain for Cuba, but thought that when your President Nixon, normalized relationships with China, that was heralded as a great thing. I don't get the difference if communism is something that was an issue.
As I have stated, Madam, we have always considered Cuba to be merely a proxy, as I have stated before, of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, in our assessment, is the real world power, along with China. It is best to deal with great powers rather than the small countries that in reality amount to nothing except as pawns in geopolitical games.
Let's talk about, so that's your rationale for Cuba.
That is the reality of Cuba.
I would like to express great appreciation for your vigilance against the ongoing threat of the Soviet Union.
How may I ask that, Mr. President? How may I ask what you mean by that?
The ongoing threat of the Soviet Union.
What do you mean, Madam? Sir.
I believe what President Ortega is alluding to is that you and President Nixon and President Gerald Ford after him, and I mean, there was this notion about the Soviet Union being such a threat, and today, as we sit here, of course, the Soviet Union no longer exists. Of course,
because we stood fast against them, because we have armed ourselves against them, because we have formed alliances against them with those governments that understood our values.
But looking back at those policies and the amount of monies and resources that were spent in an attempt to
Lives lost, of course, in an attempt to have some control over the Soviet Union, which, by the way, no longer exists.
It no longer exists, Madam, because of the vigilance and strength and fortitude of the United States.
That's nonsense. It was an empire that fell apart because the constituent countries threw off the yoke of the emperor. I don't know what we had to do with that. Nothing, I think.
Absolutely nothing. How do you reconcile that we are a pawn of the Soviet Union when we exist and they don't?
Cuba still exists.
And not only that, we're normalizing relations with them now.
Yes, you understand that they're even Cuba and Vietnam, which I must say has been a problem to us, has shifting more and more gradually to a free market economy in bits and pieces. And I do notice that the communist parties in those countries are still in power, but they are, as I have said, shifting towards a free market, and we wish to encourage that.
What is the great value of a free market?
Because
that is a very profound question.
Thank you.
The free market is the cornerstone of all freedoms. Of course, you wouldn't know that being a communist dictator yourself.
Well,
if there is no free market, we have always believed that in the United States that if there is no free enterprise or free market, there is simply no freedom.
That's what you believe. Not everybody believes that.
Your logic is stretching
Skewered.
Skewered?
How-
I don't know skewered. Stretching, I know stretch.
Skewered.
How do you mean by that, sir?
Free market as cornerstone to all freedom. That seems that people should be more free in your country.
How are they not free?
Well, I don't know. Is it free if you have the freedom to walk down the street and know that no one will ask you for your papers? You
As
can
in
walk-
your country, as in
you
Fidel
can-
Castro's country.
Well, you can go to the grocery store and you can buy a loaf of bread. But if you are free to go to the grocery store and don't have any money to buy bread, how is that freedom?
President Ortega says something that's very timely. And that has to do with right now in this country, we're facing this tremendous problem with the differences of opinion in terms of how we should handle the immigration problem, as it's called. And so the freedom, when you talk about being free, there are at least, 10 million people in this country?
11, I think they
11
say.
million who've lived in this country for many years and have children that were born in this country.
And they've contributed to society. They have jobs. They're working hard. They're paying taxes.
And they were never
And when they
formally,
walk down the
and
street,
they
they
were
get
formally
picked up.
naturalized. They never
And they
considered
walk down the
entering
street,
the formal
they get
formal
picked up because they
naturalization
have brown
process.
skins.
They never underwent the formal naturalization process.
What?
Therefore, they
Deserve to
they
be
have
picked
to they have to accept the fact that they must stand in danger of being deported. They either have to be naturalized or deported.
Their
Period.
children were born in this country.
If you'll excuse me, there is a state in your country called Arizona. You know Arizona.
Arizona.
It's very hot. Now,
Dry.
in Arizona, if a police officer or anyone else apparently suspects that you are not an American citizen, that police officer or citizen can demand that you demonstrate your citizenship by
Do you have to have
showing
your-
papers, your
Provide proof of
passport or
exactly.
what are the, I don't know all of the documents, but my question is, since the people in Arizona, the ones who are brown anyway, have been there since before the United States exists, what naturalization process would you recommend for them to avoid having to be asked for their papers?
I don't deal with that. I deal with heads of state. I deal with heads of government.
My apologies.
We don't,
This is all
we
below
don't
you,
deal with
Doctor.
certain types
So,
of things.
I'm still back when you made that statement concerning freedom and about how necessary it was or how important it was for capitalism to exist because that allows freedom. And I think from the comments that we're hearing, it seems very clear that freedom does not pertain to brown people in Arizona.
That's not my problem.
President Ortega, you don't have to go to Arizona to see that. Right here in this city of Philadelphia, if you're walking down the street and you are a brown man, you are twice as likely to be stopped and frisked than if you're not. Right here in this city, in this moment, frisked.
Meaning
Maintenance.
patted down to see if you're carrying a weapon.
And nobody gets caught with a weapon. Almost nobody.
Mr. Dr. Kissinger, I have a problem with you.
Yes.
In your history of your negotiations with heads of state, as you call them, to assuage violence and war in the world, how is it that you overlook the people who are citizens of these nationalities that you negotiate peace for, so-called peace, without concern for the rights of the people who live there? How is it that you bypass the rights of the people in the streets and the people who support those governments, unless those governments are run by dictators, as you call us? Then
It's not the I do not consider,
Dr.
excuse
Kissinger.
me, but I do not consider the so-called people of the country as part of the process of maintaining order
They
and
are the
stability
problem.
in
So
the
people
world.
are the problem? Did you say the people are the problem?
No, I think what he said is he doesn't consider the people, and
We know that.
and we have some time constraints. We're going to have to take a break and come back, but I do want to ask. I do want you to put a pin in that, if you will, and let us come back to that point, because I don't hear you saying that the people of a country have any importance.
If you
so
feel you must.
Just one moment. We'll be right back. Thank you.
Cut. Camera's rolling. Cue silent in 5, 4, 3.
Welcome back. Now, Dr. Kissinger, before the break, President Castro asked you a question as to how you rationalized what happened to the people in the countries who had a head of state that you were negotiating with, but the population was what his concern was. And I don't think that
I don't deal with the population, madam. They have no.
But your policies, don't you see that your policies have some impact on the population?
I don't worry about that, madam. I deal with powers. I deal with governments, and those are the things that matter in the balance of power between
Do the
nations.
citizens of the United States matter to you?
That's what I'm. That is what I am representing. The government and
The government. How
Well,
about
what
the
is the
citizens?
government? How does the government come to be? If you're not concerned about the citizens, if there are no citizens, there would be no government. I'm just trying to understand how it is.
That does sound convenient.
Yeah.
It's very convenient.
Trying to involve the people, the so-called citizens, has always been the downfall of countries. I mean, the liberal idea of involving the people, so-called, has proven to be a disaster.
That's
it
what
has led
George
to
Washington and
Excuse me,
Thomas
madam, I am
Jefferson did.
speaking. It has always led to revolutions, and revolutions have disrupted the balance of power between nations.
No.
And if you keep the
Revolution.
people out of the so-called people out of the government.
Keep the people. No, listen to that. Hear what you're saying. If you keep the people out of the government, so what?
So what about the freedoms we all have if we're not in
what
government?
you talked about earlier.
Right.
If we have no influence about government, what's the point
You
of
are
a free
sounding like a
enterprise?
communist, Mr. Kissinger.
House.
You are sounding like a communist that you call a communist.
Here,
The people
here,
have no rights. The
Here.
people are insignificant.
here President Ortega does land reform, he builds schools, he builds hospitals, he helps people feed themselves,
Everyone
right?
loves hospitals.
And, well,
food.
we need hospitals,
food.
we need health care,
Food
we
is
need...
nice too.
Food is
That
good.
How do you
goes
feel
along.
about citizens having food? Is that good?
Not if it comes at the expense of a dictatorship such as
But
you and Mr.
but
Castro.
when you talk, you disparage
I don't know
dictatorships.
this dictator. What is?
What is dictator?
I don't think that means what you think it means.
What do you mean? I know about dictators. I was in exile from Nazi Germany.
Let's talk
and
about
I have,
Nazi Germany.
And I have.
You fled from the Nazis.
That is correct.
Why did you flee the Nazis?
Because
They would have killed him if he hadn't.
They would have killed you.
because
I don't understand.
I am of Jewish origin and
Extraction.
You
Julio.
understand?
Ah, sí,
comprende.
Julio. Okay.
and yes, and having established myself as a citizen of the United States of America, I've dedicated myself to the service of the United States government.
And whose wishes do you voice through this representation of the United States government? Who do you speak for?
I will serve at the will of the President of the United States.
And how does he get to be the president?
Oh, that is a very good question, since people are not
He gets
important.
ordained, I suppose, from on high.
Like,
I mean, you would concede that in this representative government that we have, that the way that one gets elected to office, of course, unless you were
A
George
dictator.
W.
Bush, right.
Yes, but ordinarily it's by a numerical count of how many citizens actually go to the polls and vote for you.
Yes, but you understand that the citizens, so-called, don't even bother to vote, and not even.
Many people don't, you're quite right, but many people do as well.
So
and
they-
many people go to all kinds of lengths to get registered and to vote. And in this state, when the Republicans put stumbling blocks in the way of people having documents before they could vote, there were huge outcries. People were absolutely furious that they lost their right to vote because they didn't have some document.
But they don't vote anyway.
They do vote,
Oh,
and the law was struck down.
I mean, you witness that what happened in the 2012 elections. There were people standing online for hours.
2008 too.
And 2008, but 2012, when it became so apparent that there was a movement to do away with the right
To
Oh,
vote
to
of
vote.
people who might vote for Obama, yes.
And so that there were long lines because there were people who understood the sanctity of the vote. So I'm simply saying that you say the people don't count, but the people are essentially, and in theory, the ones who go to the polls and they elect officials. I mean,
In
that's,
theory, madam, in theory. In reality.
no, I'm saying in theory because I'm saying in theory only because we know what happened in 2000 when, in fact, Al Gore did win, but it was taken
But
from
never
him.
got to be
never
president.
got to be president.
Now, I have to say, these two gentlemen in Nicaragua and in Cuba, they understood that. They haven't always been perfect, to put it mildly. A lot of people who were their political enemies just sort of disappeared.
They went away.
But
They were.
They went
but
away.
this happens everywhere. I'm
They
not
went away.
accusing it. I'm not excusing it. But you
People come,
don't seem
people
to be
go.
any better. You don't seem to be any better.
But see, you haven't built. See, they at least can point to that their population enjoys health care. And right now, of course, you know, the healthcare situation in this country is egregious, even with Obamacare.
Chaotic.
It's
We
just
call it
chaotic.
freedom, madam.
and
Government
wait a minute,
control.
and schools. They built schools. You talk about government
roads,
and
factories.
roads, infrastructure.
Yeah.
The role of government is foreign policy and military defense. Everything else,
So,
as
wait a
in our
minute.
constitutional system, is irrelevant.
Wait, the Constitution says you have to keep the post office. How about the post office?
I
How
don't
about
deal-
the Bill of Rights?
I don't deal with every little postmaster. I deal with
I have
Dictators, I know.
Mr.
Go on, President
Mr.
Castro.
friendly
Yes.
leaders. They are, madam.
Dr. Kissinger, we do not deal with the small things that you seem not to want to even consider as a part of the daily attributes of being a citizen of your country. You do not want to deal with the post office. You do not want to deal with the hospitals. You do not want to deal with the little things, but you want to have an overarching authority that by no means have you been voted into. You have been appointed to become a diplomat for your country. But it seems to me that you are pontificating your own twisted ideas.
I am simply stating, sir, the reality of American foreign policy ever since the Second World War. We have
I think
there
it's
has always
before that.
been
Since the Second World War,
yes, madam.
Before
I
that.
think I agree with you, Babette. This is
Long
not new.
before that.
You, in fact, Dr. Kissinger, you know, we frequently have historical guests that are cut from the same cloth. You remind me so much of John Foster Dulles. I mean, you just espousing these notions about the superiority of
your class, of
your
yourself.
class. And you nor Mr. Dulles were elected to any office. You simply are appointed.
Nor could you ever be elected to any office. Since I was for many, many years, I can tell you it's not easy.
Perhaps I do not require the votes of certain people, madam.
You don't require any votes because you were appointed by a president who was hated
Now, see,
by me anyway.
and one of the things that was very important when we were talking about this panel and having you gentlemen as guests is we really wanted to examine abuses of power. And here we have before us someone has never once been elected. There's the population, the populace didn't decide that this gentleman should make decisions for them.
However, you two were elected.
However they elected, they came in through violent revolution.
Oh,
So
but
don't speak to me about...
Revolution
Dr. Kissinger are violent. That's what the nature
Wait,
of the revolution
the
is.
United
violent.
States came about because of a
Because of
violent
a
revolution.
Exactly.
That's a good point.
I mean, how do you square the superiority of the United States government as opposed to Nicaragua and Cuba?
Well, to be fair, people have been known to do very strange things for tea.
That's
Yes.
for tea. Yes,
For tea indeed.
That's right.
I mean,
Cuba.
this country was started by a revolution. Well, listen, it's always interesting to me when I hear someone speak about what is wrong in other countries, and particularly Latin America. I just think that somehow the United States is very focused on Latin America. And
We have a lot of business
Right, that's what I was
investments.
just going to ask you about.
And may I please speak that we have to protect our investments in Latin America. They keep the economy going, and we must protect them by any means necessary.
So do you have an interest in bananas?
By what?
No, I do, by any means necessary.
It's familiar. I don't.
Ex-
I've
ex-
heard that. Have you heard that?
I think
I've heard that.
By any means necessary.
Malcolm, I think
That's
Malcolm,
something.
Malcolm X.
Malcolm
I think
X.
espoused.
X, yes, Malcolm X. Yes, you like Malcolm X.
I
I like Malcolm X.
Yes, of course you would. He was a violent revolutionary just like you and Mr. Castro.
well, you just quoted him. I mean, we were just wondering.
Violent? He did.
Mr. Kissinger,
His end was violent,
the
but he didn't engineer
evidence
that.
for me shows that you are a paranoid expansionist.
Communist.
No, really.
How is that
Because
so?
your country has over 1,000 military bases and installations around the globe.
You keep the
surveillance
peace
of
around the
all
globe.
More than
Yeah, I see.
130 nations.
Which,
You have
which
mili-
maintain the peace and stability
Wait,
of
wait,
the globe.
we're
You have none
maintaining
in
peace
Cuba. You
where?
have
In the
none
Middle
in
East?
May we know where we're maintaining?
We're
Babbitt
maintaining
has a
peace
question there.
in the Ukraine. We're maintaining peace. Come on, tell
In
me where else we're
Afghanistan, you are
maintaining peace.
maintaining peace so far away
Give me a
from where
break.
no one can hurt you.
Dr. Kissinger, as you may well understand, I very much appreciate you being here. We are happy to have an opportunity to
And we
ask you
hope
some
you will
questions.
come back because we're not finished.
And we're not finished. That's exactly right. And of course, there are time constraints, and we are out of time. But we would like you to return next week
If I
because,
must.
well,
You
if you
must.
would condescend, to come back, we would
And
very
give
much
us
appreciate
your little
it.
pearls of wisdom so we know how to behave ourselves.
Spend
Well,
some
thank you for
time.
appealing to my vanity, madam.
Oh,
You're
yes.
welcome. Anytime. It seems to always work.
It does seem to work. And so I'm going to say that if we would very much want you to come back. And hopefully President Castro and President Ortega, you would return because we have many more questions for Dr. Kissinger. But in fairness to him, I think maybe giving him a week's time to collect his thoughts might be a good thing.
I
So
don't
this
need to
is-
collect my thoughts, madam.
Well, I would like to say that on behalf of Babette and myself and the entire Conversations Across Time crew, we'd like to thank you for coming tonight, and we would ask that you return next week, and we will take up this continuation of this very interesting conversation across time. But it's been such an absolute pleasure having all three of you gentlemen here tonight.
Thank you.
I will
thank
see.
you.
I will check my calendar and see, madam.
Thank you.
Thank you.